Okay, Chair, you are good to go.
Okay, thanks to Ben. I would like to call the Committee of the Whole meeting on February 6, 2023 to order. Good evening, everyone. My name is JD Pachariva, Councillor and Chair of the Planning and Economic Development Committee. We are meeting electronically this evening through Zoom. As a reminder to members of Council, we will be voting this evening by show of hands. Please remember to keep your hands up until our clerk has declared the vote or advises us otherwise. Members of the public may observe tonight's proceedings by accessing the live webcast on our YouTube channel. Members of Council are all in attendance this evening. In addition, we have senior staff in attendance to speak to their area of expertise, so welcome. As this is a virtual meeting, I will ask that we follow some procedures during this electronic meeting this evening. Members of Council and staff, please be reminded that when speaking, please ensure your camera is turned on. Unless, of course, you're having connectivity issues, then turn it off so we can hear you. Should there be a connection or service disruption for the chair, or if quorum is lost, the chair and/or clerk will call a 10-minute recess to reconnect and to regain quorum. If quorum is lost, then the meeting will be adjourned. If connection is lost from the chair, then our VC, Councillor Murray, you be ready in the bullpen. We'll resume the meeting. I should turn my thing off. No, I wouldn't do that, Anna, not tonight. Once reconnection is achieved, the chair will assume their role. Each member of committee who wishes to speak, please use the raised hand feature on your video call, and the clerk will track our speakers list today and then invite you to speak when I open it up for comments or questions. Also, when I finish reading a motion, the clerk will then call out the vote by the show of hands and ask those in favor and then those opposed. Devan, are you motioning to me, or you're just waving? Or okay, you're good. Okay. Please remember to keep your hands lifted until we've got the okay from the clerk to declare the vote or advises us otherwise. Also, if you are able, please keep your video on at all times. And when not speaking, please remember to put yourselves on mute. Are there any declarations of interest this evening? Okay, I see none. Do any members have amendments to the order of the agenda? Pretty straightforward, 2 items, so. Nope. There are no statutory public meetings this evening, and we have no consent agenda, or we have no consent items. So let's get into the meat of tonight's meeting: Planning and Economic Development Committee agenda. We are now at the Planning and Economic Development portion of tonight's agenda. Delegations, there are none. We're now considering item 7.2.1, report PD 01-23 regarding classification of 4423 Ontario Street as a Class 4 noise area. I will now ask our Director of Planning and Development, Mr. Bruder, to provide introductory remarks. Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is, if you recall, an extension. Towards the end of 2021, Council approved a zoning bylaw amendment for townhouse redevelopment or development, 18 townhouse units at 4423 Ontario Street. And what this was a condition of that zoning bylaw amendment, part of a holding provision on the lands. And the reason why it's there is in recognition that there is a noise generating property or activity occurring at the Fleming Chicks property. So what this report is confirmation that the development itself conforms to MECP noise guidelines. And really the intent of this is to recognize that yes, there's an existing operation noise generating, but it was there before this development occurred. And really the intention of this whole thing is to protect the new residents that are moving into the townhouses. Again, in recognition that it was not feasible to include any mitigation on the existing Fleming Chicks property. So this confirms that the required mitigation that was the subject of that noise study that was completed when the zoning amendment got brought forward have been implemented into the design. In particular, just a certain window rating from a noise control perspective, same with the wall construction, and then some other things such as clauses in the purchase and sale agreement, mandatory inclusion of air conditioning so that there's not as much need for ventilation in the summer months, things like that. Again, pretty standard. It is a requirement of MECP, and it was subject to the holding provision we put on the property. So really all this means it's business as usual for Fleming Chicks, and confirmation that we're protecting the new residents with required noise mitigation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Bruder. Councillor Minchima, I see you have a question.
Thank you, Chair Rivas. So I read through the report, but I guess I missed that it was part of the holding provision. Because my question is that I've never seen this come forward as a separate item. Is this typically something that we would have taken care of before we considered the zoning bylaw amendment?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that wouldn't have been possible because the intent of this, and it was identified by the acoustical consultant that did the noise study in the first place, you have to confirm that the actual design has included all of the measures. So really, it wouldn't have been possible to do it earlier on in the preliminary stages. We needed to wait until we were far enough along in the detailed design that we could confirm that all that was included.
Okay, that's fair. It's just I've never seen it come forward as a separate item like this. So
Okay, you're good?
yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Councillor. Councillor Michalak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you to Matt. So like, when you say it's going to be an agreement, and is that all going to be detailed to prospective buyers? Any of these various like garbage pickup, this noise, all of this is going to be communicated to prospective buyers, correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. They'd be clauses in the purchase and sale agreement, the transaction between the seller and the buyer. So one of the conditions of this is that, yeah, there's a warning clause just in the purchase and sale agreement that speaks to this class 4 designation.
Okay, perfect. So long as, buyers down the road don't come back to the town complaining and we have leverage.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yep, that clause will ensure that there's no surprises for the homeowner. So thank you, Councillor Michalak. So there being no further discussion, I have a motion moved by Councillor Russell. The council classify the lands municipally known as 4423 Ontario Street as a class 4 noise area pursuant to publication NPC-300, Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, MECP, Environmental Noise Guideline, Stationary and Transportation Sources, Approval and Planning, and the council direct the Director of Planning and Development and or his designate to forward a copy of Report PD 01-23 and a copy of the decision of council to classify 4423 Ontario Street as a class 4 noise area to the MECP, Fleming Chicks Limited, and 1950578 Ontario Incorporated. I will now ask our deputy clerk to call out the vote.
Thank you, Chair. All those in favor, please show your hands. Thank you. And all those opposed? Thank you. That carries, Chair.
Thank you, Devan. We will now consider item 7.2.2, Report PD 02-23, updates regarding Bill 23 amendments. I will now ask our Director of Planning and Development to provide introductory remarks. Mr. Britter, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we felt it important at this time to provide an update to council. The last time I was before you, we didn't really see anything implemented yet in terms of Bill 23. I think all of us can say it's been pretty confusing in terms of what's being implemented and when, and what's the impact to, some of our town policy documents and whatnot. So really the intention of this report was to kind of spell out what is now in place, what isn't, and here's some of the legwork we need to do now that these things are in place in terms of updating, things like our site plan control bylaw, things like our zoning bylaw and our official plan. They're going to have to change. I won't go over it all. It's noted in the report, but just to I'll give you some highlights just in terms of bringing forward some of the key ones. I think everybody's really interested in what's going on with the development charges, what's happening with some of these. So we're still waiting on some of the definitions that would feed into some of the exemptions that are being talked about for, affordable ownership, affordable rental housing. We've actually just recently checked in with the province to determine what's happening here. And really what's going to come out of that is there's going to be bulletins posted. They're already posted to provide some definitions, or they have been up until now. It's kind of a standard practice, but they're going to be revising them to identify what the definitions are, specifically, the things that we're looking for when we see this. We know that the threshold's 80% of market value, but we want to look at how is this applying based on a per unit situation. Are we considering different unit types? Councillor Murray, you and I kind of talked on that a little bit. They should be. that would make sense just because it's not comparing apples to apples. You're talking about an apartment versus a house, very different numbers. So we haven't seen that information come out yet. We're told they're working on these new bulletins, these information bulletins, but they haven't committed to a date for anything like that. So those things are kind of still outstanding. Some of the things that are in effect now specifically are when we talk about the phase in, you know, there's a requirement now that in the first year, once a new development charge bylaw is brought forward, it's 80% of the value that we charge, and then it increases by 5% over the next number of years. That's in place now, as is consideration going back a little bit further to develop service levels from 10 to 15 years. That obviously has an impact too on how, you know, we identify what the service level is. And why that's important is the difference in service level means what you can and can't put in the development charge bylaw in terms of projects. So I say all this to say we're actually initiating our review and update of our development charges bylaw, the fulsome kind of redo of it. So one of the steps in that is going to be to quantify what some of these impacts mean to us in terms of, you know, what does it do, or what type of gap might or might not it create. But at this point, it's still kind of hard because some of these exemptions, we're still not quite sure how they're going to shake out yet, or some of some of those things. So we're still waiting on details in that regard. From a parkland dedication standpoint, you can see what's in place now is all of the max rates for either parkland dedication or cash in lieu have been set. They're in place now. You can see for the amount in terms of land value or land, there's a 50% reduction, what you see there in the max value. So those are in place now, but what we don't have in place is some of the based on the conversation I've had before regarding the developer or the landowner being able to dictate what land can be provided for park purposes, and, you know, that land possibly being encumbered. Encumbered means, you know, something like an easement, or perhaps it's subject to some type of natural heritage setback, things like that. But again, that's not put in place yet. So we're waiting to hear where that comes in. When we talk about things like some of the gentle density, you know, in terms of the additional residential units that are now permitted as of right, that's in place now. For singles, semis, townhouse lots, up to 3 units in total, that is in place. So that's one of those things that requires us to amend our zoning, amend our official plan, to make sure we've got the permissions in place that allow that now as of right, as per provincial direction. There's no more meetings, public meetings now for plans of subdivision. That is in place. One of the big things I wanted to touch on, we hear a lot of regional involvement in development applications. So this has kind of been a hot topic around the region in terms of all the lower tier municipalities discussing this. What's it going to look like? Regional staff discussing how things are going to go from here. It's not in place yet. And the latest we have on that is there's going to be a facilitator being appointed by the province to come and review, you know, our planning processes here in Niagara and make some recommendations. That's still, apparently this facilitator is going to be commissioned towards the end of this month, and it will take the better part of this year to come up with recommendations. And it's suspected that proclamation of this reduced role of the region will follow closely with that timeline. In the meanwhile, the region is putting forward some options for some of the lower tier municipalities in terms of a kind of shared services, or fee for service rather, more in an advisory capacity. It's no longer, you know, a mandate moving forward. It's more just advice to fill in the gaps where we don't have certain competencies, natural heritage being one of them, things like that. So, you know, it'll kind of be a fee for service type model based on cost recovery. But again, the details of which are still being worked out because as of right now, it's business as usual with the region. Nothing's been proclaimed yet. They're just trying to get ahead of the curve a little bit. So a lot of discussions on that around the region. I'll continue to keep council informed as I hear more. Conversely, from a conservation NPCA standpoint, as of January this year, they're no longer reviewing development applications through the lens of natural heritage. When I talk about wildlife habitat, endangered species, things like that, That's not in their mandate anymore. It is, however, still in the regions who are still involved. So we have coverage for now for those types of things, scoping environmental impact studies. But they still do, the Conservation Authority still does comment on floodplain hazards and setbacks from those and watercourse impacts and things like that. So they still are involved, just been scoped down a little bit as of January. And then finally, just the last one I want to touch on is just from a heritage conservation perspective. A couple of things that are now in place that weren't the last time we spoke, specifically with the non-designated heritage list. There are 247 or so properties on there that are non-designated. The clock has started ticking now in terms of having 2 years to determine whether or not we want these properties or want to pursue designation. So right now we're just developing a scope of work to deal with that. And the other impact from a heritage conservation perspective is if a property is not already included on that list and there's a planning application that's initiated, then that property can't be added to the non-designated properties list. It can't, in other words, it can't be triggered by a planning application. So that's just a very quick run through. There's some other things that I didn't touch on, but they are in that table that was provided in the report. And then, as I mentioned, that precipitates a lot of action on our end. You're going to be seeing in the next few months some changes coming, some amendments coming to our zoning bylaw, official plan, site plan control bylaw, because now what's in place too is anything under 10 units or 10 units and under, one multi-res building is not subject to site plan control anymore, which is a big change, as is us not being able to mandate or require landscape plans or building elevations. But, you know, I've been asked a few times what we're going to do about things like that, because that's really important from a compatibility standpoint. And my answer is simple. I'll keep including them in the list of submission materials that we're looking for. The only difference now is if anybody ever took us to task, the stick in which I have to try to make sure I mandate and require that, and I must have it, is no longer in place. So that's where, you know, we build off of our relationships with some of these developers that we've formed. A lot of them do want to, you know, ensure a good product and proper transition. So my intention is to continue with those conversations. So I know it's a lot to take in. It always is with this particular piece of legislation. So I'm going to stop there and happy to take council's questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I mean, the big thing too is the, you know, the making us whole, right? And Councilor Brunet and Councilor Murray and the mayor were told that at the Roma that they're still working on it, and so were we in our meeting with Sam. So they promised us that they'll get there. So, you know, we just have to wait and see. So, Councilor Manjima, you're first.
Thank you, Chair Pachariva. Agreed. The big thing is making us whole in the long run for a lot of the financial impacts, which is really what's a big, huge part of our job, is to advocate on behalf of not only the residents in Lincoln, but really, I guess, the residents all over Ontario, and to keep everybody in mind as we move through this and make sure that the responsibilities lie where the responsibilities should lie, and that we do what we can to mitigate impact. So my question is about site plan control. And Matt, you were just talking about the proposed, well, what will be in place is that we'll no longer be able to address design through site plan. And so you're going to continue on with relationships with existing developers. You're going to ask for the kinds of things that we would normally ask for through site plan from a design perspective. So I'm wondering what you think now. What other recourse do we have? Do you think we might find ourselves reviewing our CIPs and strengthening the incentives related to design?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think that's potentially an option, but I'm not even sure. It gets a little bit sticky with that, because when you really start talking about design, there can be some level of subjectivity involved. It's hard to apply hard and fast criteria. I mean, high quality building materials is one thing, but actual design, look and feel, I think there can be somewhat of a difference of opinion in terms of how that gets approached and what applies to that. So, you know, we can certainly look at it. It's not a bad point. It's just that when you get into, you know, structuring a CIP, you have to be pretty specific with the applicable criteria, and design, it can be difficult to do that. We have other things already that can inform design, though, such as our You know, if I look at the Ontario Street Corridor, we've got our streetscape vision and design master plan. That's now, you know, we've got the high level vision in place there for what we want to see. So those are things we can reference. Again, I think at the end of the day, it still remains in a developer's best interest to, you know, come to a product that fits in well and is cohesive along a streetscape. That would be the best outcome for everybody. So like I said, I'm going to continue to push for that regardless.
Mhm. Okay, and another question, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
Okay, so 3 units as of right in singles, towns and semis, is this is in place now? So is it just for new builds, or can someone as of right create a second or even third dwelling in a semi or a townhouse? And if that's the case, I mean, it was already in place for single detached, now in place for semis and townhouses. So all that's required is a building permit. Is that the case in most cases? And I'm thinking that that has the potential of putting a lot of pressure on our building department and our fire department.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. So if there's an existing dwelling already, they could have the potential for 2 more units. Only one as an external, like the other, there's supposed to be 2 units within the dwelling, and then 1 unit external could be an accessory structure or whatnot. In terms of it just being subject to a building permit, that's been the subject of a lot of discussion too, among many planning departments. A lot of them have provisions in place now for accessory structures. We do, in terms of setbacks and things like that, building heights. Those would continue to be applicable. But again, if we're looking at this long-term, it requires some further consideration from a zoning bylaw perspective, because when we developed those guidelines, those provisions for accessory structures, we weren't really thinking about human habitation within them. So it requires a little bit of a rethink, but the general consensus is certain setbacks and heights and things like that will continue to apply. It's just municipalities are trying to figure out what the appropriate controls are at the moment. So maybe depending on what's being proposed, not necessarily that easy just to go to building permit. But as of right now, we have our accessory structures provisions in place, and that's, you know, widely accepted as what would be applicable for the time being.
Okay, so for clarification on page, I'm not sure I'm understanding it completely, but on page 6 in the chart, and by the way, thank you very much for this chart. It really helps sort out all the different changes proposed. It says that overriding at the bottom under gentle density / intensification, overriding municipal zoning. And then if you go a little further, it says in a detached, semi-detached or townhouse dwelling, this now permits a total of 3 units for lands containing a semi-detached and a townhouse, whereas previously a total of 3 units was only permitted. So 2 inside, 1 outside, even if it's a semi or a town?
That's correct. Or yeah, so I think the intent is only to have 1 accessory building. That's a good point. If there's only 1 building and they somehow manage to get 2 units in there, that might be something that's applicable in a semi or townhouse situation. But I know the intent of the policy is not to have multiple little accessory buildings all over the property, right? It should be house, 1 building. That's the intent of the policy. But I see what you mean, where you're going with you know, the dialogue or the wording on overriding municipal zoning. But I think that's more in situations where we don't allow up to 3 on lots that are for semis and townhouses. So I think that's what's meant here. That's the interpretation I'm taking. But to imply some setback or building height, I think that's completely within the possibility for us to look at.
But we do currently allow 3 units in a single or a semi, or sorry, a semi or a.
So our zoning bylaw allows in a single up to 3, but not in semis and townhouses. So that's what has to change.
And so propose, so sorry, I'm not, it's something's not sinking in, but Bill 23 says you can have 3 units as of right now in a townhouse.
Yeah.
Inside.
Townhouse property. Yeah. Well, or yeah.
So townhouse is usually attached on either sides, you know, they're joined. So the only space is the backyard. So I guess you could put you'd have to meet all the setbacks and everything, but you could put a unit in a little building in your backyard if you met all the setbacks and everything. But currently, or as a result of Bill 23, you can put 3 units inside a townhouse.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be hard to put 3 in a townhouse. It would probably be 1 out in a unit like you're talking about in a building outside of the townhouse, and maybe, 1 unit on the main floor, 1 unit in the basement, something like, or in the second story, something like that. So that's how I could see it going with a townhouse.
But 3 are allowed in a townhouse.
Hmm.
You just have to meet parking requirements, 1 per unit.
Hmm. And building code requirements, yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
Mhm.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Councillor McLeod.
Thank you very much, Chair Patrick, through you to Matt. Thanks for this chart, this information, this report. You mentioned in the report that some components will increase housing supply, reduce barriers and cost to development, and facilitate growth with a mix of housing types. I've been hearing not very much good about this Bill 23, and I'm hearing a lot of the financial impacts on a municipality that this will have. Where do you find in Bill 23 some of the highlights that stick out in your mind that will address the housing crisis within Lincoln that we aren't doing currently?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Good question. One of the things that I think is good is looking at some possible reductions in certain fees for things like purpose-built rental, just because that is not something we see a lot of, yet there's a huge demand for it. I think it could result in some improvements there through some of this. You're right. In certain situations, do I think this is necessarily going to lead to a higher amount of affordable housing? Not necessarily, but again, I think it depends a little bit more on what the province's next move is. What are they coming out with next? How are they applying this threshold that they've put in place, this 80% of average market value? If it's on a per unit basis, if it applies to apartments differently than applies to singles and townhouses, I could see there could be some traction there, and maybe providing a little bit more variety in housing stock. I think I was just talking about with Councillor Njima, some of the additional as of right permissions for some of these accessory dwelling units, I could see that as potentially being a good thing, just in terms, again, that's a different housing source, different rental option for some people, a revenue generator for those looking to buy a home. So I could see some benefit in there. And we don't, it's just widening up some of the permissions. Like I said, we only really had some good permissions in single detached, but now we're looking at options in a little bit more unit variety for these types of things. So those are some of the changes I think could be positive, and I think could add to our overall housing stock that, we don't necessarily have now.
Thank you very much for that. Trying to find some sort of a silver lining, if I may, another question. I have
Yep, go ahead.
I could ask a dozen questions, but I'll keep it to 3 right now. Through you, what, in terms of DC charges, there's going to be 0 DC charges on affordable or attainable housing, is my understanding in reading this. What are our current DC charges on a home right now between region, municipal, parks and dedication, the whole ball of wax? What does that cost to a builder?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't have the number in front of me, and parkland dedication kind of varies on, value of the land, how many units, all those things. Development charges, generally speaking, I'd have to look at the chart. I could probably dig it up for you, but I mean, we're up, 35,000, 40,000 for a unit in development charges once everything's said and done. And then there's parkland dedication on top of that.
And that's plus the region development charges?
No, the region would be included. Maybe, it'd be in excess of 40,000 for both, more than 40,000. I don't have the exact figure though.
So I'm asking that question because I'm wondering, like, when we're determining the affordable housing number that you're bringing up, and how's the province going to determine that? If some municipalities are anywhere from 40 to 80 or 90,000 in DC charges, and let's say our affordable housing threshold is 735, then there could be the possibility that a developer would just build a house for keep it under the 730 or the 80% of 735, saving that DC charges right there.
Yeah.
building it into their performa. And if that should happen, the municipality would get nothing.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, that's a good question. And one, to be honest, I've had this conversation before with some certain developers, and the general consensus is, depending on where this all lands and how, this further information is disseminated, when they look in this grand scheme of things, all the things it costs to build a dwelling, all the things that go into it, and then when you're talking about having to reduce the purchase price by 20%, I mean, just to get a break on development charges, but then you're losing that 20% you would have had on the actual price of the home. And depending where the average market price is, it might not necessarily even be feasible in a lot of situations, or desirable to try to build and get it in under that amount so you can get a break in development charges. I mean, that's some of the general feedback we've had, but again, I think it's very situational specific. In some situations that might make sense, and we might see that here and there. In some, it just might not make economic sense. And I think part of that depends on the times, how the market's doing, and a whole bunch of other factors. So it is a good point. It might happen, but again, some of the feedback I've gotten is, not necessarily, it might not necessarily still be worth it. So food for thought, just based on what I've been hearing.
And if I may, one more question, then through you. We are anticipating on new growth, on new development, we're anticipating DC charges. Have we factored any considerations to Bill 23 with future projected DC charge revenue? And what might happen if things don't pan out financially the way we're expecting?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll let Director Wagner jump in if he's got anything additional, but all I can tell you is we're actually undergoing that process now. We're initiating it. We're going to look at our new, we've got to evaluate all this in the process that we have to go through to update our development charges bylaw. That's when we look at all these things like service levels, previous service levels. We look at the project listing. We look at the growth numbers that are anticipated, and we forecast out what our development charges need to be. And a critical component of that is going to be, what are some of the potential implications of Bill 23, and what does that do to the bottom line? So those are calculations. Again, we're going to be engaging Watson. As a matter of fact, we're initiating that process literally as we speak. So I would suspect we'll have some more information for council on some of that coming up shortly as we get a little bit further into that. But that's something definitely on our radar, and we're working through it now. But I don't have any, quantitative figures at the moment that I can share with you.
I think the timing of this is important because we're going through a budget deliberation on projects that are growth inspired, and we're dependent on DC charges to fund those growths. And I think this is a timely conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilor McLeod. Vice Chair Murray.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Matt. Matt, I have a question about the third-party appeals for minor variance. I do recognize that they've said no more of that. The one particular property that you mentioned is in my ward, and there's a lot of there is some angst about this particular one. There's some concerns. Do they have any recourse at this point to present objections or challenges or concerns, or is that just completely off the table? There is no longer an opportunity for them to have input?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think you're talking about an application that's already been in front of Committee of Adjustment for decision, right?
Yeah, the one that's on 19th Street that was dismissed. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I never would be one to say that the opportunity to provide input is off the table. I'd always like to consider it. There's certain things we can consider in detailed design, albeit a little bit less than maybe what we previously could have done based on some of these updates. But how the system's supposed to work now is anybody that has a concern regarding anything that's being brought before Committee of Adjustment does what they always did. They still bring their comments and concerns forward, but now instead of having that further opportunity to appeal a decision, should it not be what they were looking for, committee's decision that is, they can't do that anymore. So now really what they're the impetus of their comments is they're providing that to the committee as they make their decision. And then once their decision is made, then unfortunately there's no more appeal mechanism. They can continue to liaise with staff and try to convey some specific concerns, and we can certainly, practice as much diligence as we can to make sure that we address them through design. But again, is their ability to actually contest the decision eliminated? It is, once the committee's decision is made.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Timbers.
Thank you, Chair Patrick, for you to Director Bruder. So I had questions around that as well, Committee of Adjustment applications, and maybe there'll be some changes coming to Committee of Adjustment as well in the future, I don't know, but the lack of ability to appeal. I wanted to ask about the heritage piece. The clock is now ticking, and I'm very concerned about how we're going to manage designations in such a short period of time to get through all those properties and figure out what needs to be designated. I guess, I know a lot of this you don't really have an answer for, but I guess I'm looking to figure out how are we going to, we can't continue the designation process the way that we've been doing it because it takes a very long time. Like, I feel like we're going to have to really accelerate it. And is that something that you can comment on, how you foresee us getting this work done in such a short period of time? And I recognize they don't all need to be designated. We know that. So we'll have to make a priority list and get working. So just if you have any comments around that.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think it is difficult for sure. It's a tight timeline considering how many properties we have. Some of the things that come to mind, I think there's certain characteristics that some of these properties do or do not share. We can use that kind of as a way to expedite the review. Maybe it's more of a simple review where it's a checklist of the things we prioritize most, and then we kind of work a little bit quicker off that. Another option, I know in the past, even with Heritage Committee, they were involved in some research projects before on some properties. Maybe there's a little bit of further involvement that can be done with staff liaison to try to, maybe there's some properties on that list that we can pre-screen out. We actually engaged our consultant who's working on the Heritage Conservation District study, which is also now an interesting endeavor because some of the rules moving the goalposts a little bit on that too, in terms of how we consider whether or not there's enough there to establish a conservation district. But they've kind of brought some of those recommendations forward too. There's going to have to be a retaining of some third party though, for sure, to help us, especially with some of the ones that may be a little bit more complex. So I'm hoping there's a variety of these factors we can implement to try to streamline the review process a little bit. And we're getting our head around that now. So moving forward, I might have some more concrete recommendations, but those are just a few that are top of mind currently.
We are looking at the Heritage Conservation Districts. Perhaps maybe that's a way to, blanket protect a bunch moving forward. I don't know. So thank you for that. And just I have one other question, Chair Patrieva, just around the gentle density. And I do see that really being beneficial to creating a lot of rentals. And, we're severely lacking rentals. So I see this being a positive. I'm just wondering, is this across the town or is this limited to just within the urban boundaries? Are the rural properties able to provide these units as well? I know accessories are, allowed at this point, but units within the main house or main building and then a unit on the property as well?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, that's a good question. You're talking about, in a rural area, let's say out in Greenbelt protected land, if there's some outbuilding or something, if that can be converted to an accessory dwelling unit or things like, I think in some situations it will be able to. I think it'll depend a little bit on things, and we've been through it even with things like garden suites from a servicing perspective. And again, you can't compromise impacts on agricultural land. That's going to be an important lens to look through. But is there some flexibility built in here in terms of providing those types of accessory or secondary dwelling units out in rural areas? I think there is. So we could see a little bit more of that as well.
Yeah, well, that's good. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Director, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Timmers. And going forward too, Matt, I mean, that outline that you gave us is an excellent a resource. And as these things come forward, changes in that, you'll update that and send that out. Okay.
Absolutely, Councillor.
Yep. Thank you so much. Councillor Rinchema, you're in again, but hopefully new questions and nothing hypothetical because Mr. Bruder doesn't have a crystal ball.
Okay, no, my
Okay.
question is just further to Councillor Murray's question. So clarification on that Committee of Adjustment application that was in for appeal. So they were waiting for a hearing to be scheduled with LPAT, and then legislation came in place and their hearing was dropped. Is that what happened? Or why was the hearing not scheduled in the first place? Do we know?
Through you, Mr. Chair, usually when you do these types of these appeals, there's a case management conference. There's a little bit of preamble leading up to them being the tribunal, establishing a date for the hearing. While all that was being put in place, these legislation changes came forward and they were retroactive. So that meant that this particular hearing was canceled. It was foregone. So unfortunately, it just fell within the transitional part of the legislation that said no more appeals for these types of things. So yeah, it got dropped.
That's interesting. Even though it may not have been the delay, whatever it may be, may not have been the fault of the applicant, it was still dropped. So they were in the mitigation process. Like, do you know that? Was it just they were in the process and it was dropped? Would they have liked to have continued with the hearing?
Through you, Mr. Chair, by they, you're talking about the appellant?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't hear a whole lot from them. I think they anticipated when they saw what Bill 23 was and what was coming forward that this would happen. So I didn't really hear any feedback from them after the fact, but we were at the point, or they were at the point rather, where it's not even really in the mitigation stage. It was even before that, where just establishing what evidence was going to be brought forward. So those were the types of conversations, just establishing that. They try to scope out what that evidence is from the outset, to try to streamline the hearing process when it happens. And that's where it was when it got canceled, the hearing.
When the hammer fell.
Correct.
Or the axe. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Councillor Russell, you're up.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question to Mr. Bruder and potentially Mr. Wagner. I'm just wondering if you could give me some insight into how much developers require or rely on pre-construction investment from potential purchasers for developments. I'll bring it back to Bill 23 in a second. If you can just give me an insight into what what your thoughts are on that.
Maybe I can start through you, Mr. Chair. Just kind of, I think what you're asking is in terms of pre-sales, things like that, yeah. So I had heard recently that with how difficult lending has become to establish it, that they need with certain projects up to 80% of sales to be complete before they can get the proper lending they need to fulfill the project. So that's just a ballpark. That's a number that's been floated to me.
So thank you, Mr. Bruder, on that, and through Mr. Chair, follow up. So with that in mind, and I heard like between 70, 75, so 80 is a little bit higher, but that's it's quite an astonishing number. How do you think, and when you're looking at Bill 23 and the incentive to build rentals, without any pre-construction investment coming in, because these are going to be rental units, how do you think developers are going to be able to afford to build these buildings with rental units as part of them, or complete rental properties if they don't have that pre-construction investment to fund it?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, that's an excellent question. And that's one that's kind of been brought up to me as a countering concern to some of these, we'll call them incentive to build more purpose-built rental. That's kind of some of the pushback that's been conveyed to me. I think ultimately, maybe there needs to be a different approach to lending for these purpose-built rentals. I know some are advocating with banking institutions to do it. I don't know if that's going to be successful. I don't know what role the provincial government plays with that. But again, I think it needs to be looked at a little bit differently, because to your point, having that upfront money is just not going to be possible. There could be more partners being brought on board to mitigate the initial cost. But then again, that means going further, the profits resulting from the rentals are less for each. So it is a little bit of a conundrum. But again, I think there needs to be kind of a reevaluation of how lending goes with purpose-built rental. I don't know if that's on the table or not, but I can't see any other way.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just a last comment on it. Again, I agree, and I'm looking at this, and again, obviously, I think some of the other councillors had mentioned about how important it is to get rentals. I think Councillor Timmers and Councillor Njema both mentioned it in this meeting, linking it across the province in some variation. But knowing that we are in a bit of a cash crunch already and liquidity is becoming an issue, and to your point about lending being an issue, like I just don't know how these are actually going to come to fruition. As they're, again, on paper, it looks fantastic, and the expectation, I hope, isn't that regions or municipalities are going to assist and drive some of those incentives even further when they can't afford it. I'm just wondering what the actual end outcome is going to be from some of these processes and results from this bill. And it's unfortunate the timing of what's going on with the economy, but it's just one of those things where I'm having a hard time really putting together what the timeline is going to be that we actually may ever see any of these being built. That's all. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And maybe a follow-up to Councillor Russell's question, both to Director Bruder and Wagner, might be, you know what, I think the pitfall might be is that you'll see your smaller developers squeezed out. I think your larger ones will still be able to bankroll this. They've developed relationships with the lending institutions. I don't think they'll have any issues, but I think your smaller ones might get squeezed. Just and you know, the larger ones, and much like we see on the P3 builds, right? It's your large corporations that are still in the game.
Yeah, and if I could, Mr. Chair, I think that is a possibility. Some of the smaller developers typically aren't building the huge projects either, but I think a lot of it too is for some of the ones that can provide a little bit more financial backing. I think a lot of it depends on how the market's doing too. If inventory is turning over quicker and sales are up, that means there's potentially a little bit more surplus in terms of revenue available to start, you know, funding for a project. But again, it all depends on how their stock is moving. How is it being sold? How quickly is that moving? So I think that factors in as well. The faster it is, and the more sales they get, that would work towards a positive situation for them. But all good points for sure.
Yep. Councillor McCluck.
Thank you very much, Chair Pachiriva. I'm not actually going to ask 100 questions, but I'm going to ask a fourth one. How does, through you to Matt Bruder, the conservation piece to this? So currently lands that fall in conservation authority that are not developable currently, my understanding in reading this is that they will not have jurisdiction over this and it'll fall on the municipality. Who will it be? Council that makes decisions on whether or not a property that was previously not able to be developed on because you know, of any stipulations the conservation authority might have had? Is there a possibility that council now, or who would preside over that decision?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it depends. Like the Conservation Authority is still going to provide regulation for things like floodplain hazards and things like that, setbacks from the water courses. They'll still be involved in that. But you're right, some of the natural heritage stuff, you know, if there's critical wildlife habitat there, they're not going to be as involved. But that doesn't mean other agencies aren't. Right now, the Ministry of Natural Resources, from an endangered species standpoint, for example, they have regulation in place. When you talk about some of the natural heritage, some of the other woodlands and things like that, and just wildlife habitat in general, There's still protection afforded currently by the region, but there will be a time when the region's involvement is lesser, that some of these certain things, you're right, we'll have to develop kind of our own set of policies regulating some of these things. And really how that would work is we would likely incorporate, the region has a bunch in their regional official plan now. Once their role in planning is reduced, we're going to be required to roll in the critical aspects of their official plan into ours. So some of these natural heritage protection measures will likely be rolled into our official plan that way, but any new ones that come out of it that are our responsibility to identify, they would come to council for consideration and approval too. I mean, you know, we can't implement things like that and revise our official plan without council approval. You would see them, but that's how it would be implemented. We would update policy within our planning documents that still speaks to the protection as needed for these types of things that are no longer covered by the Conservation Authority. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. It just, thank you. Just a follow-up to that. What expertise does planners have with regards, that's why we have these conservation authorities. What expertise do planners have with regards to these sorts of aspects of land use?
Well, through you, Mr. Chair, I mean, there are planners that have special designations. They're ecologists. There are a myriad of services that can be provided either by a third party. Again, when I talked earlier about some of the fee-for-service items that the region can provide, they have some in-house specialty as well, because they scope study requirements for development applications from an environmental impact perspective. So there is definitely some outreach we can look at. You're right, in-house right now, we don't have any staff that have that specific specialty. So we would likely have, if we have to update policy as needed, we would have to likely look for that again, either through working with the region on an advisory role or retaining a consultant to help us develop the proper policies for that.
And thank you. And I'm just asking that for any future potential financial impacts to the municipality. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good questions. There being no further discussion, I have a motion moved by Councillor Reimer. The council received report PD 02-23 regarding Bill 23, More Homes Built Faster Act 2022. I will now ask our deputy clerk to call out the vote.
Thank you, Chair. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Thank you. All those opposed? Thank you. That carries.
Thank you very much, Devan. We have no confidential items this evening. Do we have any committee remarks? Okay. There being no further business, I call this meeting adjourned at 6:57 p.m. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good job, Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.